You find yourself being overwhelmed by things that shouldn't overwhelm you. A conversation goes sideways and you're replaying it in your mind for hours. Someone raises their voice, your chest tightens, or you walk into a room and suddenly feel like you don't belong. It's not every moment, but it happens often enough that you've started to ask yourself, is there something wrong with me? You've heard the word autism and you may have even started to identify with it, but something still doesn't seem to quite fit right. Because the label may explain your traits, but it doesn't explain your experiences. Not fully, not deeply, and not in a way that helps you to move forward. You've probably been told that autism is a list of traits: social awkwardness, sensory sensitivity, shutdowns, rigid thinking, executive dysfunction, maybe even a lack of empathy. But here's what almost no one stops to ask. What do all of these struggles have in common? Because when you step back and really look at it, not from a diagnostic checklist, but from lived experience, you start to see something that's been completely overlooked. Every single one of these so-called autistic struggles involves emotional distress. Shutdowns don't happen unless something becomes too overwhelming. Masking doesn't happen unless there's fear of rejection. Routines don't become lifelines unless unpredictability feels threatening. Sensory overload, that's your nervous system screaming that something isn't safe. It's all emotional. It's not about behaviors. It's not about traits. It's about a system under pressure, a nervous system that's constantly being pushed into survival mode. And yet the mainstream model doesn't talk about that. Instead, it says these behaviors are symptoms of a neurological disorder. It frames them as broken wiring, as if you were born this way and there's nothing you can do about it. But what if that's not true? What if emotional distress isn't a side effect of autism at all? What if it's the driving force behind most of the challenges that get labelled as autistic? That single shift in perspective changes everything. Because if emotional distress is the real root, then we have to stop obsessing over surface behaviour and start asking the right question. What's causing the emotional system to react this way in the first place? And once you start asking that question honestly, you begin to uncover a much deeper and far more empowering truth. Because the source of your distress isn't out there. It's not the world, it's not your brain, it's something else entirely. And once you understand that, the whole picture starts to come into focus. Most people go through life believing their emotions are caused by what's happening around them. A stressful conversation makes them anxious, a loud noise makes them angry, an insensitive comment makes them shut down. It all feels automatic. This happened, so I feel this way. And because it seems so obvious, no one ever really questions it. But when you take a closer look, that logic starts to fall apart. Because if events caused emotions, then everyone would react exactly the same way to the same event. But we don't. Two people can experience the exact same situation, and one walks away unfazed, while the other breaks down completely. So it's not the event itself that causes the emotion, it's something deeper. It's the meaning that gets applied to the event. Now take something like a phobia, a fear of balloons, for example. Logically, there's nothing threatening about a balloon, but someone with a balloon phobia will have a full-body panic response when they see one. Their heart races, their breathing changes, they feel real fear. Not because of the balloon, but because of the meaning their brain has attached to it. That fear lives in the nervous system, not in the object. And it's the same with almost every emotional reaction we have. The event isn't what creates the emotion. The emotion is created by the meaning we apply to that event. And that meaning isn't random. Your brain is constantly comparing the present to the past. It's looking for anything that feels similar to something you've experienced before. And if it finds a match, it pulls that emotional memory forward and applies the same meaning to the current moment. That's how your emotional responses are created. Not from logic, not from choice, but from the emotional associations your brain has learned to rely on. And this is where things start to get really important. Because if your emotional reactions are based on old memories, then your current struggles might have very little to do with who you are and everything to do with what you've been through. Once you understand that emotion comes from meaning, not from the event itself, you start to see just how much of your experience is shaped by the past. But that meaning doesn't come from conscious thought. It's not something you sit down and decide. It's fast, automatic, and built entirely on memory. Your brain is constantly scanning for familiar patterns. When something happens, whether it's a tone of voice, a facial expression, or a sudden change in plans, your brain immediately searches your memory bank for anything similar, and whatever emotional charge is attached to that old memory, that becomes the emotional meaning applied to the current moment. You don't think your way into that reaction. You feel it instantly. Let's say someone interrupts you in a conversation. On the surface, it's no big deal. But if your emotional system links that interruption to past experiences of being dismissed, ignored, or made to feel small, your brain doesn't just see an interruption, it sees a threat. Your heart rate might spike, you might go quiet, you might start overthinking. That's not an overreaction, that's your system doing exactly what it was programmed to do, reacting to the meaning it's been taught to associate with that moment. Now imagine how many of these meaning patterns are running in the background all the time. You're not just reacting to the present, you're reacting to a lifetime of stored emotional meaning. And if you've had more emotionally painful experiences than most people, especially ones that were never fully processed, then your brain has far more material to draw from. That means more triggers, more reactions, more overwhelm. This is the missing piece almost no one talks about. When you feel emotionally hijacked, it's not because you're too sensitive. It's because your brain is pulling from an emotional archive filled with unresolved meaning. That archive is what's shaping your experience, not your personality, not your identity, and definitely not some permanent disorder, just a system running old emotional code. By now, you can probably start to see the pattern. Emotional triggers aren't random, they're learned responses, shaped by unresolved experiences from the past. But here's where things get even more important. Those labeled as autistic tend to have far more of these unresolved emotional imprints than the average person. And that's not because they're weaker or more emotional or overly sensitive. It's because from a very young age, sometimes even before birth, their emotional environment often lacked the safety, stability, or attunement required to properly process experience. They weren't given the same opportunities to make sense of overwhelming moments or to emotionally return to baseline after stress. So instead of resolution, those experiences got stored and they stacked. What makes this especially difficult is that many of those early experiences weren't extreme or dramatic. It wasn't always about trauma in the traditional sense. Sometimes it was subtle, a caregiver who was emotionally distracted, a home filled with stress, a parent who didn't know how to co-regulate. But to a developing nervous system, those patterns matter, because when you don't feel consistently seen, felt, and emotionally safe, your system starts to interpret the world as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. That's when the emotional triggers start forming. And if those early experiences continue, if school brings more misunderstanding, if peers reject you for being too much or too different, if you keep getting punished for how you naturally express or process emotions, those emotional imprints multiply. One triggering moment becomes 10, then 100, then more than you can count, each one reinforcing the others, and eventually your system becomes hyper-responsive to things that other people barely notice. That's why those labeled as autistic often seem to overreact. It's not that they're reacting to one small thing, they're reacting to a lifetime of unresolved emotional weight that's being activated in a split second. From the outside, it looks like disproportion, but from the inside, it makes perfect sense. The reaction fits the meaning, and the meaning fits the history. If what I am saying is hitting home, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know. Can you see moments in your life where emotional stacking may have shaped your reactions? You don't have to have it all figured out. Just share whatever's coming up for you. I read every comment personally and I reply to them all. Once emotional triggers begin forming, they rarely stay isolated. One unresolved experience becomes the foundation for many more. A single moment of emotional overwhelm, rejection, or confusion might not seem like much on its own, but the nervous system doesn't treat it like an isolated event. It stores it, it tags it, and the next time something even remotely similar happens, that old emotional file gets pulled up and replayed. The meaning becomes stronger, the emotional charge becomes heavier, and the body reacts even faster. This is how emotional stacking begins. It's not just a series of bad memories, it's a network, a feedback loop. Each new triggering experience reinforces the earlier ones, adding more emotional weight, more urgency, and more confusion. Eventually the original memory gets buried, but the pattern remains. You might not remember the first time you felt overwhelmed in a crowded space or rejected for saying the wrong thing, but your nervous system does. It's still running that meaning in the background, and every new experience that fits the pattern just stacks on top. And here's where it becomes self-perpetuating. The more emotionally stacked your system becomes, the more reactive you get. And the more reactive you get, the more likely you are to have negative experiences. People misunderstand you. Relationships strain, social situations backfire, and those moments, no matter how small, add another layer to the stack. Over time, this can create a kind of emotional architecture that shapes your entire reality. You're no longer responding to the moment in front of you, you're responding to everything it reminds your system of. This is why healing can feel so difficult, because you're not just dealing with one emotion or one situation, you're carrying layers, reactions that were stacked over time, many of which you may not even remember. And the moment that started it all, you may never know what it was. It could have happened before you had words, before you had memory. It might have seemed small or insignificant to the adults around you, but your system felt it and adapted. That's all it needed. The good news is you don't need to remember what started it. You don't need to dig through your entire history or relive painful memories. The key is to begin where you are. Because once you start working with what you can feel, what's showing up now, your system already knows how to find the rest. Healing doesn't depend on uncovering every detail. It depends on creating the right conditions for those patterns to finally let go. And once that process begins, the weight starts to lift, layer by layer, trigger by trigger, without needing to consciously know where it all began. If you followed the logic this far, a natural question begins to form. If emotional triggers are what shape our reactions, and if those reactions eventually form the patterns that get labelled as autism, then when did all of this begin? Most people assume that memory starts in childhood, that memories begin around age 3, that anything before that couldn't possibly matter. But that's a modern illusion. Neuroscience has already shown that memory doesn't begin with language, it begins with experience. And the nervous system begins storing experience long before you have the ability to describe it. Studies have shown that a fetus can begin forming memory patterns as early as 20 weeks into gestation. Not memories of events or images, but emotional states: stress, safety, disconnection, calm. These early states don't require thought. They don't need language. They simply imprint. So if the environment in the womb is emotionally unstable, if there's chronic stress, fear, anxiety, or emotional distance between mother and child, the fetus begins adapting. The nervous system starts shaping itself around those signals. And after birth, if that environment continues, if emotional safety remains inconsistent or unavailable, those early adaptations don't just fade away. They become the foundation for how the child relates to the world. And here's where it gets misunderstood. Professionals often try to find proof of trauma based on what an adult would consider traumatic, but a fetus or infant system doesn't measure experience the way adults do. A moment that seems insignificant to a parent, a lack of eye contact, a delayed response, a distracted caregiver, might feel profoundly unsafe to a developing nervous system. The event itself doesn't have to be extreme. What matters is how the system interprets it and how it adapts to feel safe in the future. This is where neural divergence begins, not as a disorder, not as damage, but as a series of micro-adaptations, each one built in response to a world that from the very beginning felt emotionally unpredictable. Once the nervous system begins adapting to early emotional conditions, especially if those conditions feel unpredictable or unsafe, the path starts to shift. The infant isn't simply growing, they're already adapting. And those adaptations don't just shape emotional reactions, they shape how the brain develops, how the world is perceived, and what parts of reality feel worth engaging with. In emotionally safe environments, most children develop a healthy balance between two core cognitive styles: empathizing and systemizing. Empathizing is the natural ability to sense what others are feeling, to intuit emotional states, and to respond in socially attuned ways. It develops through repeated emotional connection, co-regulation, and consistent feedback. When a child is met with warmth, presence, and emotional accuracy, their brain builds circuits around that feedback. They learn to read cues, adjust tone, understand subtle signals, not because they're taught, but because their system feels safe enough to stay present while those patterns unfold. But when emotional safety is missing, when connection is unpredictable, overwhelming, or even threatening, empathizing doesn't fully develop. It's not that the child lacks the potential or ability, it's that their system is too focused on emotional self-preservation to engage with others. It's busy scanning, bracing, withdrawing. In that state, social learning can't land. It's like trying to download a file with no internet connection. It just doesn't process. Meanwhile, another cognitive style begins to take the lead, systemizing. This is the drive to understand things through patterns, logic, predictability, and control. Unlike empathizing, systemizing doesn't rely on emotional feedback. It thrives in solitude. It builds through repetition. It finds comfort in structure. And for a child whose emotional environment feels overwhelming or inconsistent, systemizing becomes the safe place, the one thing that makes sense when people don't. Over time, the brain wires itself around that preference. Pattern recognition deepens, emotional cues remain confusing, predictability becomes a lifeline, and slowly a new trajectory forms. Not because something went wrong, but because the system did what it had to do to stay safe. This is the beginning of neural divergence. What gets labelled as autism isn't a hardwired condition. It's the visible outcome of an invisible adaptation. A system that chose logic over connection, not out of preference, but out of necessity. When you trace this path all the way back, from shutdowns and overwhelm, to emotional stacking, to the meaning your system applies, and the adaptations that began before you could even speak, what you start to see is something the medical model never taught you to look for. This was never about a disorder. What gets labelled as autism is, in many cases, the natural outcome of a highly intelligent system adapting to emotional conditions it didn't know how to make sense of. It didn't break. It adapted. It wasn't damaged. It was diverted. And if that's true, if the root of these struggles isn't neurological damage, but unresolved emotional triggers, then something incredible becomes possible, because emotional triggers can be cleared. You don't need to change who you are. You don't need to fix your personality or mask your way through life. What you can do is begin untangling the emotional code your system has been running on for decades. You can release the stored meanings. You can calm the survival patterns. You can shift the way your brain responds to the world, not by forcing yourself to be someone else, but by removing the emotional weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. And when that happens, the world begins to feel different. Interactions don't feel so loaded. Sensory input doesn't feel so sharp. Social spaces don't feel like emotional war zones. It's not that life becomes perfect, but it becomes possible, fluid, alive. And for the first time, you begin to meet yourself without the filter of survival. What's left underneath all of those old responses isn't something broken or less than. It's something deeply powerful. A system designed for depth, for pattern, for intuition, for clarity. It was never about turning that off. It was about removing what was blocking it from shining through. You're not here to cope. You're here to reclaim what the world couldn't reflect back to you. And now that you understand what was really happening, you can. And if this video has helped you to see yourself differently, even just a little bit, then let me know in the comments. Your story might be just what somebody needs to read to begin their own shift. You never know who you're helping just by sharing what's real. Now, if what I've shared in this video has resonated with you and you've started to see your struggles in an entirely new light, then I've created something that can take you even deeper. It's a free guide called Breaking Free: How Emotional Triggers Shape Autism Challenges and the Path to Healing. Inside you'll find a full breakdown of everything we've talked about today, plus a few insights I didn't have time to cover in this video. So if you're just beginning to question the medical model of autism, or you've known for some time that your diagnosis doesn't fully explain your experiences, then this guide will help you to start making sense of it all. You can download it for free. Just click the link in the pinned comment below. Because once you understand what's really driving your struggles, you can finally begin to change them. And if you haven't done so already, check out this video up here. 7 signs of autism in women that might not mean what you think. It connects powerfully with everything we've covered today, and it might just be the shift in perspective you didn't realize you needed.